Hey, I'm Zannerman. Vigilant is a mod for the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. It was initially released on the Nexus in 2015, and it has been developed further ever since. The last update by the time of this recording was in October of 2023. The mod is primarily made by a single modder by the username of Vigilant. His mods are developed in Japanese, but there is a translation and an English voiceover made by the community. These efforts are led by the user Alar. Alar has also posted several write-ups on the lore and story of Vigilant's mods on Reddit. Vigilant handles some deep Elder Scrolls lore, and does not do the greatest job of explaining things beyond the surface story. So, you should refer to Alar's posts if you are left wondering, hold on, I need to check how far into the video this is, what the fuck is going on? But I'll note that some of it is outdated, and Vigilant might have changed story details since then, as new official lore is released, such as through Elder Scrolls Online. So don't take everything as the absolute truth. Vigilant is also responsible for two other large story mods, Glenmoral and Onslaught. The three are tied together in terms of story and certain recurring characters, and are meant to be played as Vigilant, Glenmoral, and then finally Onslaught. At the time of this video's release, however, Vigilant and Onslaught are complete and have endings, but the second in the trilogy, Glenmoral, is still a work in progress, and while almost complete, it lacks an ending. I have played Vigilant before, which according to the Nexus was in 2019. I had forgotten a lot about the mod other than the broad strokes of the story. It has also changed and been updated since then, but I had some previous understanding of the story. Before making this review, I played through Vigilant for a second time, as well as Glenmoral for a second time, and then finally Onslaught, completing the entire trilogy. The mod is split into 4 acts. Act 2 and 3 are fairly short, while Act 4 is larger than the first 3 put together. In essence, the first 3 acts tell the story of how you get to the point in the story where Act 4 starts. There are choices that can lead you to skip directly to Act 4 throughout the first 3 acts, but I will expand more on that later. Act 1 is story focused, taking you around different locales in Skyrim. It's fairly traditional in narrative and quest structure, and has you introduced to the Vigilants and the antagonist. Act 2 is more of a single dungeon crawl, and it's heavily inspired by Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Act 3 is a horror-themed manor section, and Act 4 is more of an open world. This is where the heavy Souls inspirations come to the forefront of every aspect of its design. I mentioned that it's inspired by Dark Souls twice already, and that becomes overt in the later parts of the mod. Pretty much every aspect of the later parts of the mod are directly influenced by the design of the Souls series, to the extent that it might be considered a rip-off. You can find armors and weapons from Dark Souls on NPCs and enemies you come across. If you find the thought of coming across the Onion Knight from Dark Souls 1 as an enemy in Skyrim as an immersion breaker, you might suffer in Vigilant. While I didn't have that problem personally, I can see that it clashes with Skyrim's style. I could make a whole video on the mod's inspirations.
But it is not this day.
Vigilant does enough things on its own that I don't think it's just a copy-paste job. I think the Vigilant has his own interesting story to tell, and it's well worth experiencing. The story in Vigilant tackles some interesting pieces of Elder Scrolls lore, and tries to build on the lore and spin it with its own storyline, rather than contradict it. A lot of care and thought has clearly been put into the story, and the lore surrounding it. The mod is obviously made by a fan of the Elder Scrolls series, based on how well researched it is. It takes lore elements from Elder Scrolls Online, writings of Kirkbride, and the mainline games, and combines them. But Viken provides his own takes on events, and a cast of characters of his own to supplement the ones taken directly from Elder Scrolls lore. In fact, you would probably have a good time if you had the wiki up while playing, and just searching it for terms and characters as they come up, because the mod doesn't bother to give you any context in the moment. The mod also has some great dungeons and level design that give you interesting locations to explore and nice vistas, coupled with great enemy variety, encounters, and boss fights. It rewards you with a variety of equipment like weapons and armor and buffs. And the rewards, while they increase the power of your character directly, they feel like they are earned due to the challenges that the mod has you face. It all comes together to form a great experience. Make no mistake, this mod is huge, the size of an expansion. This review will take a different format to my previous mod reviews. I will go more in depth on the moment-to-moment story beats of the mod, and as such there will be major spoilers. But before that, if you want to know if the mod is worth playing, I can say that yes, I believe so. It does have a more grimdark theme compared to Skyrim. In a previous video, I covered Beyond Reach, and I don't think Vigilant reaches the level set by that mod. But it does stand in contrast with regular Skyrim in a similar way. If you don't mind spoilers, or have played through it yourself, then let's continue. The mod begins in the town of Dawnstar. In the Windpeak Inn, you're approached by the wood elf Vigilant of Stendar, Altano. He gives you the option to join the Vigilants, beginning the questline. At the inn, you can also find another NPC, Orlando the Knowledgeable. He gives you an option to skip directly to Act 4, but as I want to actually play the mod fully, I decided to skip his morally dubious ass. The start is pretty bare bones and abrupt. It really doesn't want to explain itself, or do too much onboarding. The way you're introduced to the Vigilant faction and you joining them feels impatient. It wants you to immediately rush into the story the mod wants to tell. You follow Altano through the wilderness, maybe get attacked by wildlife along the way, to a new location called the Stoon Ravine. There you're introduced to the Vigilant headquarters, and immediately starting the second quest, Bloodsucker. At the Vigilant headquarters, there are two other named NPCs, Keeper Thorindir and the Librarian Gwyneth. Neither of them are really fleshed out much at this stage. In the library you can find some books. Some of them are on par with the ramblings of the wayward husk from Beyond Reach. What I mean by that is that it's incomprehensible gibberish that you lack the context to understand, which might be partly having been translated from Japanese, partly just how the mod author writes, or partly trying to emulate the writings of Kirkbride, because the trilogy is very much based on whatever bullshit Kirkbride dreamt up. An example. Though all given concavities, or sheets within the integument of the orbis, are necessarily contained by the orbis, right-reaching dictates that a defined sheath may be detached from the integument by invocation of the Mnoli. Upon intercourse with the Star Orphan, the beseeching elastic performs aversion of the organ of thought, and employment of the hurling disc that recapitulates the truth of a circle turned sideways is a tower. By same truth, twisting the enveloping sheath into the middle dawn, to the number of 17, brings it to untime and unplace. I'm left wondering when and how exactly books like these were meant to be read. After playing the trilogy, I can see the connections, but unless you are somehow familiar with all the deep Elder Scrolls lore and the acid trip of Kirkbride, it would be hard to parse this to any meaningful extent if you just jump into this without prior knowledge. But the books touch on the following subjects: the prophet Maruk, and a stone that seems to burn those it touches, and Laza, one who hunts the ones that were burned, Molag Bal, Daedra and his realm of oblivion, Coldharbour, Lamai, the first vampire, and Lamai's kin, her offspring, the Ayleid, Jabal the Khajiit, and Laza, and the three grayscale owls, white, grey, and black, and the Elysian Order. Let's see what comes up as we delve deeper, shall we? You can explore the Vigilant headquarters. The Librarian Gwyneth sells some basic Vigilant gear, and there are a few treasure chests you can lockpick. Nothing is counted as owned, so you can steal everything that's not nailed down without consequence. There is a notice board in the courtyard, where you're introduced to a devotion and karma system, but this system is not given much of an explanation. I'll go more into the notice board later. For now, let's just get more acquainted with our Vigilant brothers and sisters and see how we're introduced to the Vigilants with our first mission. Bloodsucker is our first quest. We're to travel with Altano to Whiterun, where the priest of Arche has reported that they're dealing with a vampire problem. You can either travel with Altano or meet him there. A nice little touch. You speak with Joel, the priest of Arche, in the Hall of the Dead, and Altano tells you to find the vampire. You can find an NPC called Baal in the Drunken Huntsman, who is obviously a vampire, or evil, or both. Surely not related to Molag Bal, that would be too on the nose. Anyway, she's unresponsive for now. You can talk to a Khajiit in the Bannered Mare called Giovanni. He tells you that he is looking for another Khajiit, Navarro, who is evil. He also informs you that the vampire killed people near the Temple of Kinnereth. So I check it out, but there was nothing strange going on at the temple or around it. so I wait for nighttime because that's when vampires usually operate. I find the vampire posing as a prostitute. She transformed into a vampire beast and I have to defeat her. After which I report back to Altano at the Hall of the Dead, who has basically done nothing this entire time except for talk to Joel. That ends the quest Bloodsucker, starting the quest He Who Cannot Be Touched. After meeting Altano at the Bannered Mare, you learn a Daedra has been sighted at the ruined house outside of Whiterun. There you come face to face with the Dremora Vernacus, and are forced to fight him with Altano. The summoner, however, has escaped. Altano will gather more information about the summoner, and you're to meet him in the Bannered Mare for the next quest, Lazy Afternoon. When you speak to him at the inn, he tells you that there's been an incident with the Daedra at the inn in Windhelm, so that is the next destination for your journey. At the Candleheart Hall, you catch sight of Baal again, and find the Daedra lying on his back on a rug. Altano tells you to deal with the Daedra while he goes off and, I don't know, talks with people or something. You kill the Daedra to continue the quest and return to Altano. He says that he will continue to look for signs of the summoner. When you talk to him again at the inn, he sends you to Kynesgrove, where rumor has it there is a man that can turn people mad with a gaze. In Kynesgrove, you meet Baelor and Anton the Brilliant. Baelor tells you that he met a woman that gouged out his eye and put a stone in its place. You can return to Altano with what you learned, but ultimately, Altano tells you to kill Baelor. Now, Anton is a cultist of Meridia, and you can ask Meridia for help, but this too will kill Baelor, so he will die no matter which choice you make. You return back to Altano at the Candleheart Inn. He tells you that he received word from Stendar's beacon that the summoner has been seen in Riften, but you need to head to the beacon for more details. This starts the quest Dine and Dash. At the beacon, the leader of the Vigilance there, Jacob, tells Altano that a Daedra was summoned at the Bee and Barb in Riften, so you and Altano head there. The Daedra Umkaos has been eating all the food at the Bee and Barb, and when confronted, will turn hostile and attack. After killing him with Altano, Kirava asks you to cover the cost of the food that the Daedra has eaten. You can pay for it yourself or borrow money from Altano, but it is a bit nonsensical to demand payment from those that get rid of a problem. Then you head back to Jacob at the beacon. Brother Jacob tells you that the summoner has been pursued into the Ratway, but his vigilance were stopped by a warrior clad in ebony armor. He sends the two of you into the Ratway, and Altano tells you to meet him at the Ragged Flagon, beginning the quest Thus Spoke the Khajiit. In the Ragged Flagon, Altano says a Khajiit named Giovanni summoned a Daedra, and he will seek out the Daedra while you deal with Giovanni. You venture deeper into the Ratway and come across Giovanni. You learn that he was taught how to perform a Daedra summoning ritual by the glowing woman, before he turns hostile and tries to kill you. You kill him and enter his dream. In his dream you see his life with Campaner Ra, before the Khajiit called Marso kills her and skins her hide. You fight the dream Daedra Empusa, before returning to the world. As you return towards the Ragged Flagon, you encounter Marso who turns hostile after you speak with him. You discover Campaner Ra's hide on his body, which you can return to Giovanni's body before you return to Altano at the Ragged Flagon. In the quest Old Guilds, you and Altano return to Stendar's beacon to speak with Brother Jacob. But upon your return there, you discover that the beacon has been attacked and the vigilants there are dead. The summoner's mercenary, a man clad in ebony armor, has cut them down, and to proceed you have to go through him. He is a tough fight, tougher than any of the previous enemies I encountered. On his body, you find the key to the beacon and letters from Kareen and Lillian, his wife and daughter, just to make you feel like shit for killing him. Inside the beacon, you find Jacob, and you learn that it was indeed Baal that was the summoner, and she serves the Daedric prince, Molag Bal. This is a shocking revelation. Altano goes on ahead while you escort Jacob through the corridor where he gets visions of his past. At the end, you reunite with Altano, who has done nothing but wait for you at the end of the corridor. You enter the altar of Molag Bal, where you face off with Baal and her two Dremora guardians. It can be a tricky fight. Baal uses ice magic that deals a lot of damage, and the Dremora will put pressure on you in melee. After defeating them, you see the spirit of Rahel leave Baal's body, and talk to Jacob, and then Jacob perishes. It turns out that Jacob traded his wife's soul in order to survive an incident in Windhelm, one where he was the last survivor. It's a neat little story, but Jacob could have been introduced earlier in the story for more of an impact. Altano tells you to give him the mace of Molag Bal you find on Bal's body, so he can bring it to the Vigilants at the keep. Then he sends you to hunt witches near Iverstead in the quest No Mercy. You travel to an area near Iverstead where you find a shack with Kareen and Lillian. Now this is where the mod actually gives you a choice. You can kill them, as Altano demands. You can return to Altano, and he will once again demand you kill them. You can relent and do so, or he will become hostile and strike you with the mace and force you to kill Kareen and Lillian against your will, or you can kill Altano when he becomes hostile. So after killing him, a Daedra named Ugly One appears, and you are forced to fight it too. After you defeat it, Kareen will enter, and demand revenge for you killing her husband earlier. Defeating her will allow you to kill her or leave her alive. I left her alive because she hadn't been portrayed as evil yet. This path seems to be a recently added one. It does skip out on 2 boss fights you would have on the other path. If you kill Kareen and Lillian against your will, you can fight and kill the Glenmorla witch, Rhaeda. While you do that, Altano will have killed all the Vigilants at the headquarters, save for Gwyneth. You follow Altano to the altar of Molag Bal, where you witness him being eaten by an avatar of Molag Bal, which you then have to fight and kill. Now back to the good path. I returned back to Thorindir and informed him what has happened. He took the rest of the Vigilants to Stendar's beacon, and left me in charge as keeper of the temple, and that ended chapter 1 of Vigilant. I went back to check on the altar, and found that the cave had collapsed, with the Molag Bal dragon under a rock slide with a Vigilant sword stuck into it. This is actually a pretty badass end for Thorindir and the other Vigilants, giving their lives to defeat Molag Bal's avatar. But it does reinforce that your choices don't really have any real impact on the world, only really on your own morality. The portrayal of the character of Altano was a bit strange. He turned evil at the end, but his portrayal throughout the story was very shifty. Throughout the story, he pushed much of the tasks onto you, while he did nothing, or forcefully demanded you make morally dubious choices, such as killing Baelor, which led me to suspect him being evil or in league with the Summoner. But the mod does seem to imply that it wasn't until he came into contact with the mace of Molag Bal and the altar beneath Stendar's beacon that he really turned to Molag Bal's service, which is a pretty quick fall for a Vigilant. Orlando, at the start, does imply that Altano has a bloody past, and perhaps a guilty conscience, or perhaps he was killed and replaced by the Daedra you fight if you do fight him at the altar. But that doesn't line up with him getting eaten by the avatar of Molag Bal if you don't kill him. Regardless, I never really formed a connection with any of the Vigilant characters. Jacob, Altano, and Thorindir. Altano because his morality was questionable, and he seemed to leave you to do all the heavy lifting. Thorindir really didn't have any interactions beyond the initial introduction to the Vigilants. And Jacob, you meet him twice, then he dies. He was more fleshed out than the other two, I think. But frankly, I think I would have cared more for Jacob if we had played through his defining moment before the conclusion of Bal's and Jacob's storyline. As it is now, Jacob's story is explored after we see its conclusion. Throughout the first act, you find pieces of a red stone on several characters you have to kill as part of the quests, such as Giovanni or Baelor. This stone seems to have been distributed by Bal or Rahel, and connected to the Daedric prince Molag Bal. Everyone touched by the stone seems to have come into his service in some way, or their souls are given to him at the very least. I wasn't able to determine if they serve any purpose beyond the narrative, so they only seem to serve as a connection to the stone that burned people that we read about in the library. So after Act 1 and your first real assignment, the Vigilants you joined have been reduced to 2 members, Gwyneth the librarian and you. Vicken has clearly identified Bethesda's core theme of the Vigilants of Stendar, that they are wholly inept and exist just to be killed or corrupted to establish a threat. But this leads us on to Act 2. Act 2 begins as you exit the temple and find a Windhelm guard standing outside. Prisoners have gone missing from the Windhelm prisons, and they ask for the aid of the Vigilants of Stendar to solve it. So, as the last remaining Vigilant, aside from the librarian Gwyneth, you go and report to the steward of Windhelm. The steward is not Jorleif, but a new NPC that is standing at the Great Hall of the Palace of the Kings. He tells you that prisoners have gone missing in the palace dungeons, and recently, several guards as well. You investigate the prison and find blood in all the cells. Whatever took the prisoners was violent. You find a maiden statue in your investigations, but the steward doesn't know much about it. So you go back to the Temple of Stendarr to research, and find a report of an incident where vampires were found underneath Windhelm. It is the same incident where Jacob's team of Vigilance was lost, and where he called on Molag Bal. Anyway, you learn that the way past the statue is with vampire blood. With your research done, you can return to Windhelm and delve down past the maiden statue. You fight your way through a skeever-infested sewer system until you start finding blood fiends. Soon you come face to face with an old Vigilant, Gvaji Fro Agnam, who turns into a more powerful vampire. Defeating him will grant you a key to the Old Well. Entering the Old Well, you are approached by Paolo, another former Vigilant, who runs away after your brief discussion. You can follow where he runs off to, but this leads you into an ambush. In order to continue, however, you have to hunt him down, because he has the key to continue. Once you do, you enter into the old Windhelm ruins. You fight your way through the ruins, and it is infested with vampire beasts. Eventually, you'll face a gatekeeper called the Nightmare of Ilinalta. More references to Ilinalta later. It drops a key that allows you access into the Asylum, a prison where vampires are being locked away. There you find Thingol, one of the few vampires you can talk to. He will warn you of Jericho, who happens to just show up behind you, kid, with 2 Blood Knights. You defeat them and learn about the Blood Matron who dwells further into the palace. Thingol begs for you to kill him, and you can give him Stendarr's mercy. You continue to the Enchantress's palace, where you meet Aradhel, and his boss fight is pretty cool. He has his own attack animations and can make himself invisible. Once defeated, the path forward to Lamai is open. You find her in a casket in the inner chamber, and when you approach, you are teleported to a dream realm of sorts. There, you are escorting Lamai to a castle, and she will then turn on you. After the battle, you reappear in the chamber with Lamau in the coffin. Only, she is withered now. A battle ensues where Lamai will respawn after you kill her, making her functionally invincible. Until you figure out you can use the dagger you took from her body, the Bard's Dagger, to stab the manifestation of Molag Bal on the throne, which ends the battle. With that, the vampire threat is dealt with, and you can return to the steward for your reward. This also begins Act 3, with the quest Child of Oblivion. The dungeon in Act 2 might be one of my favorite dungeons in Skyrim. It establishes the history of the dungeon well before you even enter it, and then expands on it as you go through it. It has plenty of shortcuts to open, and while incredibly linear, it has some good encounters, and the various sections of the dungeon feel different. You have the sewer section, and the old Windhelm ruins, the asylum, and then finally the palace. The enemies are also well established. Many of the blood fiends or feral vampires and vigilant vampires are established by the texts and environmental clues. It has some variety in enemy design, in that there are blood fiends, blood knights, blood liches, and standard vampires, and feral ones, coupled with a few special vampires. In short, I think it's good. The dungeon has foreshadowing, a mystery, build-up, boss fights, and then finally payoff and reveals at the end. Narratively, I think it's solid. It even has ties to other parts of the mod in the form of Lamai and Jacob's whole storyline. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that Jacob's defining moment is revealed after the end of his story, when, in the face of overwhelming power of the Blood Matron, he called on Molag Bal to save himself, in return for his wife's soul, and dooming his vigilant companions to their fate. Which, I think it would have made the finale of his story we see in Act 1 stronger if we had experienced this part of it first. Lastly, while my memory always makes it seem longer than it was, it's actually fairly short, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Now that Act 2 is over, let's talk about the notice board. The notice board gives you Radiant quests that take place around Skyrim. These are repeatable, and will award you with 3 different stats: Karma, Devotion, and Radiance. There are 2 different factions you can do quests for: the Vigilants and the Holy Pipers. The Vigilant-related quests award you with Devotion and Karma, while the Holy Piper quests award you with Radiance and Karma. Now, what do these stats actually mean? Who knows? And by that I mean, the mod doesn't really tell you. Karma is used for the end of the mod. If you have more than a certain amount of Karma, you gain the possibility for a certain ending. However, you don't actually need to do any quests to reach this level of karma. In Act 4, you can get almost triple the amount of karma you need. Devotion can be used to increase some of your stats like health and magicka, or stamina. Radiance seems to be related to a different way of escaping Act 4, and tied to the Natomancers, whose portrayal in the trilogy is anything but good. But seemingly, it's also a way to increase your stats, similar to Devotion. Now, who is the Anatomancer and the Holy Pipers, I hear you ask? Well, let me explain. Love is violence, hate is peace. I am, and I are all me. Anatomancer is you, Chim and anti-Chim, Charmat, Hotator. Did that make it clear? I thought not. It's an amalgamation of all your potential failures combined into an entity, because you may achieve Chim in the future. It is like a glitch in the Matrix. Now, why am I explaining this when it would become clear in the later parts of the trilogy? Because for me, it didn't become clear in the later parts of the trilogy at all. And this is based in peak Kirkbride acid trippery. It doesn't really matter if you know this fact, because the trilogy is primarily about the journey, and the destination will be the same if you follow the path. But it does help contextualize what the Anatomancer may say, or his actions. It's an example of the mod having lore that is so obscure that without help or guidance, the average player will come away feeling confused. I know I was, and I don't even consider myself a good measuring stick of an average player. Sometimes understanding does help a player's enjoyment of the story. On to Act 3. Following your return from Windhelm, the Vigilant headquarters has been reinforced with several Vigilants. They are generic NPCs and none of them are named or have any extra dialogue, but it does make the place feel a bit less lifeless. Gwyneth informs you that a Vigilant, Bartholo, has sent a request for aid. He was investigating a manor near Coral belonging to the Bruyant family. The Bruyant family is comprised of Marcus, Julia, and Julius. But the wife, Julia, was found dead in Lake Ilinalta, burning, with a curse laid upon her corpse. You may recall the nightmare of Ilinalta you fought in Old Windhelm, and one of the books mentioned a village near the lake in Ilinalta that was found slaughtered by a vampire boy around 10 years old, linked to the kin of Lamai. So Lake Ilinalta seems to be linked to the vampires, and, by extension, to Molag Bal. There's a carriage waiting for you outside the temple. You can use it to get to the mansion. Be warned though, once you go to the manor, you won't be able to return until you complete Act 3 and Act 4. At the manor, you're greeted by Bal, a butler. Who this man is, or who he could be in the service to, we may never know. He seems to be an Ayleid though. Once you go inside the manor, you'll be stuck there. In the first room, you'll find the dead body of Marcus. Most of the story of the Bruyant family will be told through notes scattered about, and it starts on the body of Marcus, where you find your first note. Now, Act 3 draws a lot from horror. Many of the creatures evoke body horror, and there are creepy imagery and sections where you will feel dread hiding from creatures beyond your ability to kill, as well as a couple of jump scares and stuff. As we've ventured through the manor, we'll find statues of Molag Bal, which you enter and go through a Daedric realm in order to reach a sigil stone. You interact with these to cleanse the statue. They function much like the Oblivion gates in Oblivion. There are 5 statues in total, and each one contains a short level with a boss at the end. When you cleanse one, you will also unlock more areas of the manor to explore, so progress is locked behind the Oblivion realms. You progress through the mansion, you find notes, you evade monsters, and you destroy statues. After the final one, you're approached by Bal, who attempts to murder you, but you murder him right back. You return to the Great Hall where the body of Julius is discovered. You dispel the dagger used in his ritual murder, and his spirit manifests into a boss fight. After defeating Julius, Molag Bal appears and gives the player a choice. They can martyr themselves and die in the fire that has just erupted, or Molag Bal can give them an escape. If you turn him down and martyr yourself, your character will die, and you will create a new Vigilant who is sent to investigate the manor, finding your previous character's dead body. He also finds a portal. If you take Molag Bal's offer, he opens up an Oblivion gate, and you are sent to Coldharbour. So no matter which choice you make, you will end up in Coldharbour, where Act 4 takes place. On the notes we find throughout the manor, we can start to piece together what actually happened here. Marcus was on a trip to the city of Markarth, where he met a woman who was owned by a slave trader. He purchased her freedom, and they had immense sex. She became pregnant, and he cast her out because of it. Julia, Marcus's wife, found out about it and beat her up so bad she ended up in a hospital on Carrero Street.
What a story, Mark.
She took revenge upon her husband through a pact made with Molag Bal. Julius, her son, became the conduit, and Julia herself burnt up, and her body was discovered burning in Lake Ilinalta. Corruption started to spread through the manor, and servants began to die. Marcus called for the Vigilant Bartholo to investigate, but he was unable to overcome the curse, and began to grow weaker. Slowly, everyone in the manor was killed. The Aeliad butler, Bal, seemed to be linked to the murders as well. The people who got close to Bal were the first to be discovered dead, but what his exact part to play remained a bit unclear. Maybe it will become clear in Act 4. It won't. Bal might be the nameless bard, the person who was with Lamé, and the person who was taken over by Molag Bal in order to defile her. He was in love with her, and called on Molag Bal because he wanted to be with her. But that turned out, well, terribly for him, and for her, who turned into the first vampire. Now, why is he still alive? Far as I know, there is little explanation, other than that he is in service to Molag Bal, and can't die, naturally at least. I don't know if he will respawn when we kill him. He might, given some information we learn in Act 4. The manor is quite short, which I was thankful for, as I'm not a huge fan of the horror featured in it. Not as a quality issue, but more of a preference for the type of horror. I do enjoy some types of horror, like cosmic horror. Still, quite well executed for a Skyrim mod. While it may feel out of place to have to run from creatures when you're the Dragonborn, Slayer of Alduin and Miraak, I get that it's hard to evoke any type of stake or unease when you can just face tank anything. Modding is a great space for exploring game design and figuring out what works and what doesn't. The fact that this manor section is so different from the rest of the mod makes it clear that it was a space for Viken to explore the designs of games that inspired him. Which I can assume are games like Resident Evil, Amnesia, The Dark Descent, or Silent Hill. And while I'm not a fan of the genre, I can appreciate the implementation and effort put into this section of the mod. And if you really don't like the horror or the gameplay, there is a built-in way to skip the whole thing by talking to Orlando at the start of the act, before you enter the manor. Now on to Act 4. Act 4 takes place in a new world space called Coldharbour. This is where the Souls inspirations really shine through, in bosses, armor sets, weapons, lore, and level design. It is also as big, if not bigger, than the first 3 acts put together. As I mentioned before, the first 3 acts are basically the story of how you get to Act 4. There are multiple ways throughout the story that you could have ended up here, with bargains struck with Molag Bal or with Orlando. This makes Act 4 feel like the main part of the mod. When you arrive in Coldharbour, you wake up in a priory tended to by Inquisitor Pepe. He wonders if you're part of the Aletians, but you can tell him that you're a member of the Vigilant. Pepe will tell you about the area you find yourself in, the waterfront district. He warns you of a flying worm and of Vernacus, the lord of the district, who is also one of the Daedra you fought in Act 1. The priory functions as a base of sorts. You find a stash here and several items. The stash is linked to several other base locations you can find throughout Coldharbour, so you can safely stash all your treasure. You also find the Eye of Maruk and the Shriveled Husk. The karma mechanic starts to become more important here, as with the eye you can view your karma and some other stats. Once you step outside, you can start to explore Coldharbour. The waterfront district is like a slum district, where both Soul-Shriven, Dremora, and Myr with their sanity intact reside. It brought me some Planescape Torment vibes, being a hodgepodge of planar entities residing together. Unfortunately, this impression does not last beyond this small area, as everywhere else, the majority of creatures will be immediately hostile. The mod gives you a lot of different NPCs to meet here. Some of these are returning characters from the previous acts, but there are several new ones. Some of them are involved in quests, some are followers you can recruit, and the rest act as merchants, but every NPC does serve a purpose. In order to proceed from the waterfront district, you have to get a key from a scamp captain, or lockpick the door to Vernacus' fort. Once inside, you fight your way up the tower to Vernacus himself, and slay him for the key to advance. The mod does make use of a lot of locked doors that require keys to open to progress, which you often get by defeating a boss. On the path from the waterfront, you were attacked by Menta Na, a Molag Bal dragon that might be the corrupted form of Altano. You discover this after you defeat him and find Altano's equipment on his body. Defeating the dragon is necessary to continue, because it holds the only key to the Great Gate that blocks the path forward. One problem with that is that it might be a major roadblock if you're playing a melee character. The dragon almost requires you to fight it with ranged weapons, as it never lands anywhere that a melee character can reach it, until it is already low on health. Beyond the gate, you encounter Pepe again, and he tells you of Gigalag and the forces of order. A quick rundown of what is happening and why Vigilant's version of Coldharbour is as it is that Gigalag and the Grey March is invading Coldharbour. There is a barrier that protects this section of Coldharbour, but it has been weakened. The region is modeled after the Imperial City, but it is a twisted version of the Second Age Imperial City during the reign of the Elysian Order, which was corrupted by Molag Bal, who manipulated them with the Adabal. Well, I say Adabal, but it is in fact a fake version of the Adabal, drafted by Molag Bal, that functions as a soul gem, and so it corrupted the Elysian Order, sending their souls to Coldharbour. But really, the purpose is just to give you a bunch of mythical figures to fight. You'll come across official lore figures like Pelinal Weistrake, Saint Alicia, Umbra, Murrayhouse, and Belharza. Many of them you can actually fight. After the waterfront district, the map opens up. It can be split into the outer circle and the city itself. You can move around either clockwise or counterclockwise. There are a lot of dungeons to explore, locations to visit, and loot to find, and a lot of enemy variety. Most locations are optional. You don't actually have to complete that much to finish the main quest, but I completed everything I could before finishing the mod, because I enjoyed exploring the region. You also gain karma by completing boss fights, red phantom fights, finding specific items, and completing NPC side quests. There is also a nice variety of armor sets, powerful weapons, and items that give you karma, and even items that give you permanent boosts to health, magicka, stamina, and carry weight. While that could feel like too much of a power creep, it did not really feel overly generous, because it felt earned either by careful exploration or behind dangerous boss fights. The mod doesn't really guide you. Many of the side quests take too much inspiration from Dark Souls. They don't really tell you where to go next to proceed. However, if you loot the Eye of Maruk, you can enable quest tracking by using the item. There is also a guide available on the Nexus for side quests, if you don't want to miss anything. That said, if you are thorough, I do think you'll be able to complete majority of quests without using quest markers. Heck, I did. The mod is well enough designed that it leads you to important NPCs and locations if you explore, and you won't need to backtrack too much. There isn't so much of a set story to focus on in Act 4. You basically have a single goal, to get into the inner district and the tower at the center of the Imperial City. That is where you will find Molag Bal, so you fight your way through enemies and bosses to reach it, being somewhat guided by Pepe along the way. There is one snag in the story, and that is that you have to power down the barrier around the inner city in order to reach the Imperial Tower. That will also power down the barrier, keeping the Grey March at bay. In order to do so, you have to enter Malada and find the Prophet Maruk. I did start to feel fatigued by the time I hit Malada, and I don't think that it was because I had had too much of the mod or was impatiently expecting the end. I think Malada was one of the weaker parts of Act 4. You fight the same 3 to 4 enemies over and over, in linear corridors filled with nothing but just enemies. While the area at first was interesting, it quickly got repetitive. Even the ability to eat the monkey people didn't make it more interesting. Once you get to the end of Malada, you find the Prophet Maruk, and Pepe joins you again. This is actually where the mod's endgame begins. Once you start it, the game world will change, as Maruk is the one powering the barrier keeping the Grey March out. Once you deal with him, the Grey March will begin invading, and Laza will invade the room, presumably encasing Pepe in crystal in the process. You can fight Laza in a boss fight, and he is quite strong. but you could also just run away. Now the Grey March invasions are kind of interesting, but implemented perhaps not as well as they could have been. They will continue to infinitely spawn enemies. Once you get 3 Hearts of Order, you can close the rift by interacting with it. By closing a rift, it kills any of the remaining Grey March creatures from that rift, which can be looted for hearts. But if you have 3 hearts from a previous rift, you can just run directly to a new rift and close it instantly. 3 enemies will always be spawned at a time, so when you close the rift, they'll die, netting you 3 hearts. So after the initial rift, you can instantly close any other rifts and just keep going, gaining enough for the next rift by looting the dead. So while it is an interesting idea, gameplay-wise, it doesn't really hold up. By the time the Grey March happens, I had explored pretty much every area of the mod, save for the battlefield and the center of the city. If you head out to the battlefield, you can fight through the Grey March to get to Jigalag, and have a boss battle with him, which was a neat little dungeon. The inner city and the tower in the center is the main quest. You ascend the tower, going through endless waves of Order and Daedra soldiers fighting each other. As you ascend the tower, you come across a ghostly Pepe. You fight a Dremora Lord boss, and find the headless body of Saint Alicia, before you finally reach the apex. There you will find Molag Bal behind his throne, in a weakened state. You can speak to him, and then kill him and take the Adabal from him, the red stone from the stories. With it, you open up a portal to return to Aetherius. On the way, if you have enough karma, you can find a slain Molag Bal statue. Depending on your choices, he will be holding a different thing. Interact with it, and you will enter into the epilogue. You can also just ignore it and head straight to the portal that takes you back to Skyrim. In the epilogue, you go through a ruined world. There are some memories along the way you can interact with, but inevitably, you come face to face with Molag Bal again. And this time, it is a showdown in the form of a boss fight. After you murk him for a second time, you interact with a husk by the tree, and you are transported to a scene with the Bard and Lamai. A set of final choices are presented. You speak with Lamai before she is called away by a servant. The most important choice you will face is whether to interact with the loot or the spawn. You can also find Molag Bal here, who will have a few words for you. These choices will determine which ending you get. The spawn will tell of how the Bard fell to Molag Bal's service, while the loot will be a more positive spin. After the ending, you will find yourself back by the Molag Bal statue from earlier, and you can use the portal to Aetherius to travel back to Skyrim. When you return to Skyrim, you wake on the shores of Lake Illinalta, after having been fished up from the lake by a Khajiit and 2 Cat Khajiit with the same names as Giovanni and Campanar Ra. Meanwhile, the Khajiit who fished you up, and you can speak to, shares a name with the Khajiit you encountered in Coldharbour. You can even ask them about it, but they are not the same person, just sharing the name. What relevance these Khajiit have to the plot remains unclear to me, but it does give you a tie-in to Glen Morrell with a warning about the chick traders. Now from here, you can return to the Vigilant headquarters to talk to Gwyneth, who has been worried about you. If you had done a certain side quest involving Belharza in Coldharbour, you can also meet a Minotaur here, who will take you to his tribe, where you can unlock him as a follower. This also indicates that your character had a real impact on the timeline with their meddling in the past. Vigilant features a lot of custom music. Much of it is used specifically to set the mood for various boss fights or set pieces, and it adds a lot to the experience. Here's some examples. The voice acting added by Alar's translation mod does add a lot as well, but it is wildly variable in quality. Some of the characters also don't really sound as I would imagine them to. That said, I can't really fault a mod for that though, when the alternative, and perhaps the expectation should be for mods, that there is no voice acting at all.
What in oblivion is Wabbajack? Do you know anything about it?
I want you to accompany me. Hurry up and prepare for the journey. The vampire won't wait for us.
There is only one way out. Submit to me.
It even uses some spliced dialogue in places.
Yesterday, my guards disappeared as well. Nobody saw anything useful. That's why I'm sending you.
There are some standouts. There's a section that has the Sheogorath voice, which is a treat to listen to.
Nothing but a pale beast of Sithis! The first cry of the stillborn king resounded like a bell.
The translation mod is also highly recommended. Almost necessary, in fact, for just being a straight-up better translation. Now, this is all just the basics. I'm just stating that this happens and then that happens. The actual content of the mod has a lot going on, and some of it ties into the other two mods, Glenmoral and Onslaught, but I'll talk about that more later. The story of Vigilant starts way before your character even exists, when the nameless bard pleaded to the Daedric prince Molag Bal to let him be with the Nedic princess, Lamai. When Molag Bal twisted that wish and defiled Lamai, the bard took on the name Bal and began his servitude to Molag Bal. When the Needs burned the body of Lamai, she awoke as the first vampire and slaughtered her entire clan, all save for one, a shepherd that would later come to be known as Laza. After Gigalag is freed, in Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, he begins an assault on Coldharbour, perhaps directed there by Laza, who has entered into Gigalag's service. Altano from Act 1 might be the manifestation of a part of Bal, or the Nameless Bard, who escaped Coldharbour and was found by Jacob freezing to death in the snow. During your actions in Act 1, Molag Bal takes an interest in you and marks you. He needs a soul, a dragonborn soul, to power the Adabal, and in doing so, opening a path into Aetherius. The story of the mod dumps you in the deep end, without context for what these things are. If you already know the basics of the lore being covered, you would probably have a good time. Like the Pelennor Whitestrait memory, where you fight through hordes of Aurorans to reach Umaril. If you have no idea who Pelennor or Umaril are, you have no context for this whole set piece. But it is one of the coolest set pieces in the entire mod, and it is entirely skippable if you don't find it, since it is an optional memory. The mod also presents a lot of timey-wimey bullshit with memories from the past, the whole corrupted version of the Second Era Imperial City, and visions. In many of these memories, you are allowed to make decisions, but which decision is the one that was made in the current timeline? Is the decision you made the one that was made in the current timeline? The mod doesn't bother to explore time travel that much, but it does contain it, and it chalks it up to Dragon Break, which is like an official lore reason for retcons happening. So your actions can have an impact on your timeline with the choices you make, as evidenced by the inclusion of Bilharza's questline, that has a real effect on the game world outside Coldharbour. But as far as I know, there aren't many other world-space changes in the base game Skyrim due to your actions. I only recall two decisions that might affect things outside the mod, and that is if you antagonize Rhaeda, she will send minions to attack Iverstead, which might lead to NPCs dying. And if you leave Coldharbour through the Anatomancer, some random NPCs will turn into maggots. Generally, I feel like time travel makes a mess out of a narrative, and while Bilharza's quest is a very minor and pretty inconsequential part of the mod, the ending of the mod itself can cause a dragon break. The mod doesn't delve deep enough into it for it not to raise a lot of questions, and potentially detract from the narrative, depending on how you interpret it. There is a deep and engaging story being told in this mod that is generally very lore-friendly, but the fractured and needlessly vague manner in which it's being told, that jumps around to different places and times, and expects you to already have knowledge of the deep Elder Scrolls lore, makes it pretty confusing to follow for those that don't already know the lore. Now, I do understand the surface stories from just playing, but there is a lot of happening between the lines, as it were, and parts that are only hinted at. Then there are also inclusions of his own storylines and characters that will be more fleshed out in the latter two mods. But after reading Alar's posts on the story and lore, I noticed that there is a lot that I didn't pick up on. Another source I can recommend is the Owl Curator on YouTube. He has several videos that give a clear and concise explanation of the story of Vigilant. For instance, I wasn't able to figure out what Molag Bal's goals were, from just playing through the mod. From what I can gather, it seems he wanted our Dragonborn soul, which is eternal, and use us to invade Stendarr's realm, and possibly have us stop Gigalag and the Grey March in the process. But depending on the ending you get, you can turn that around on him, and while you can't outright kill him all like Ball, you do weaken him. I think for those who really like delving into lore and the story of games, and analyzing them and finding connections between different points of lore, there is a lot here for you to enjoy on that front, and that can be a pretty rewarding experience that exists beyond just playing the mod. To get interested enough to be invested in the lore to that degree, you do need a certain amount of buy-in, and the mod has backing of existing Elder Scrolls lore, and the mod itself is of very high quality, not to mention that Vigilant constructs its own narrative through connections with two very other large mods. The slave traders, or chick traders, are heavily involved in Glen Moral, for instance. The story of Marcus and the slave in Markarth also gets expanded on in Glen Moral. Many characters, such as Junal, Orlando, the Anatomancers, and the Owls, have bigger parts to play in the greater trilogy. While Vigilant has the shallowest connections to the other two mods, I feel, it doesn't depend on Vigen's original characters as much as Onslaught and Glen Moral, but it does lay a foundation for the stories told in the other parts of the trilogy, making Vigilant part of a greater whole. And while it stands out great on its own, it benefits from being part of a greater story. I'm of the opinion that the trilogy is enough to build an entire mod list around once it's finished, or more accurately, once Glen Moral is finished. It is a missing puzzle piece to experiencing the full story, as by Onslaught, you should have some understanding that Onslaught seems to imply that Glen Moral's ending will bring. It is an endgame questline that goes beyond the events of the main quest, Dawnguard and Dragonborn, a truly epic journey that goes through the ages and unravels the inner workings of the world. Although if you do play them after the base game, and in the intended order of Vigilant, Glen Moral, and then Onslaught, with the same character, there's some real dissonance between what your character is capable of in the narrative, what they are actually capable of, and what they have already achieved in the base game, particularly some parts of Glen Moral. But that mod isn't finished yet, and may have some skips to Act 4 planned, similarly to Vigilant. Vigilant also features an epilogue of sorts that bridges the gap between Vigilant and Glen Moral a bit more. If you head to the Ratway in Riften, you can find the Anatomancer's room, answer some questions posed at the door, and you can enter and speak with Pale Feet. Kill him and you'll get a choice of what to do with him. It'll tell you some cryptic clues about what is to come in Glen Moral. I have some complaints with the mod that I have brought up throughout this video, but in the grand scheme of things, they are very minor ones. I didn't suffer any crashes related to the mod, and very few bugs I can directly attribute to Vigilant. I played it on a custom mod list, and there were some incompatibilities, primarily with out-of-the-box NAT ENB, and some very strange animations on bosses, possibly caused by the boatload of MCO animations I had. While my mod list was more soulsy and built for playing through the trilogy, that is by no means a necessity. Vigilant works well with regular Skyrim's combat as well. I did use the mod Vigilant Female Remaking, as it fits with the whole Asian-made Western dark fantasy aesthetic I was going for, and I felt the NPCs needed some improvement. Here is what the characters would look like without female remaking with my mod list. If you don't want to go for the Asian style, there is also Vigilant NPC Overhaul and Vigilant NPCs Refined, which improves the NPCs but retains a more grounded look. That's all I really had to say regarding the mod. If you own Skyrim, you should really try Vigilant. It's like a whole new expansion and well worth your time. Anyway, that's all for this video.